Hi everyone, thanks for joining us for this session. My name is Markos Sfikas. I work for Bavarica as a marketing manager, and together with me, I have Grace. So Grace.
Hi, Marcos. Thank you. My name is Griselda Cuevas, and I am the Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion at the Apache Software Foundation, as well as a product manager at Google Cloud.
Perfect. So today we will be talking about equity and inclusion as a way of developing diverse, resilient, open source software. So more specifically, if we go to the next slide, we will see that we will discuss some common challenges for open source communities. We will go over the state of diversity in open source at the moment. Then Grace will take us over the diversity and inclusion from the view of the Apache Software Foundation. And we will close off with some of the efforts of the Flink community when it comes to diversity and inclusion as well. So over to you, Grace.
Thanks, Marcos.
Perfect.
So before getting started, I would love to ask some questions. And as you see the questions, just think for a moment if you have experienced any of them in your project at some point. The first one is, have you ever felt that your project maintainers have felt overload or even burnout because there's so much to do? Have you ever just feel like you are drowning in the number of open bugs that you have in your Jira or reports or things that need to be fixed to better improve your technology? Have you ever feel like the growth ratio of your project is not going fast enough, or even that the adoption is going very slow? Have you had communities in other countries that have just independently started using and sharing information about your project, but never really have been able to engage with them? If you said yes to at least one of these things, it's probably because you need to grow your community and foster a more inclusive environment. So maybe equity, inclusion, and diversity could be the answer to your problems. And we're going to walk you through like how these three concepts can help your project become like a more solid project, grow faster, and also be a better community overall. Here I'm going to pause for a minute and mention that equity is the concept of providing to each individual what they need to be successful at the same level. For some, that might mean more mentorship, more time to get ramped up. For others, might be other resources in other languages or other type of support. So equity is about that. Inclusion is about making sure that everybody in the table has a time to speak. Their voices count, and their opinions are considered in the project or making important decisions. Diversity at the end of the day is the goal, and it's a representation of how diverse and how many varieties of different backgrounds and skills your project has. So now I'm going to pass it over to Marcos, who's going to talk about how diversity is overall in the tech industry and in open source. Back to you, Marcos.
Thanks, Grace. So even before we go into the diversity in open source, let us first define what what diversity and inclusion means for open source. And it's really that process of employing and attracting a diverse team of individuals that is basically reflective of the society that the technology and the framework and the community operate in. And as Chris mentioned before, diversity is really the metric that we measure. Inclusion is the process for the community to become more diverse, and equity is really the outcome of that process. So providing the same opportunities to everyone for their voices to be heard in the community, for their contributions to be valuable in the community as well. So if we go to the next slide, we would really start looking at why do we even talk about this, and why does that concern us? So what we see here is that even with a relatively even gender split in the US, we see that when it comes to the developer population, the female developer population is actually only 20% of the total developer population. And diving deeper to the open source software, we see that only 3% of that population is female. And while gender diversity is only one attribute of the different characteristics that define a community's diversity, we will see later on that there's a similar pattern across all other diversity characteristics when it comes to someone's education, sexual orientation, where they come from, where they've been educated, even what language they speak. So if we move to the next slide, Grace will take us over the diversity and inclusion from the lenses of the Apache Software Foundation.
Thanks, Markos. So last year was an important year for the Apache Software Foundation because we established the Diversity and Inclusion Committee. So now I'm gonna just walk you very quickly through the goals that we set for this committee. In 2019, we have 3 immediate goals. We wanted to achieve, first of all, gather scientific data to understand the composition of our community. We wanted to know what is really the baseline and the starting point in which we will be working. The second goal was that we wanted to raise awareness in the community about how diversity and inclusion can improve the impact in the open source industry. And lastly, we wanted to collect a key of measurable indicators that can help us understand where we are, where we want to go, and what is the progress that we're making towards that goal. For 2020, we have more immediate, more medium-term goals that included instrument the Apache Foundation funnel, understand what it looks like, and also identifying what is the churn rate in each of the stages. Are people contributing to the project to stick around for a long time, or do they stop contributing after a while? After looking at how this funnel look like, we want to create a toolkit that will be instrumental for projects to take all these tools and improve the way their projects are inclusive and diverse. And lastly, we want to become the go-to partner for all the project management committees to reach out to us whenever they want to implement a diversity and inclusion initiative. We want to have all these tools together, ready to go for whenever each of the projects are ready to implement them. So talking about the first goal, which was gather measurable and scientific data to make the Apache Software Foundation knowledgeable of where we are, we are collecting this scientific data with 3 efforts. A community survey. We're also gonna implement a project metrics analysis for a few projects that volunteered and want to use technology from the vendor who's helping us analyze and gather the scientific data and are interested in participating. And the third effort is the new contributor and mentor friction logs that we are collecting from the outreachy internships that the Diversity and Inclusion Committee also launched this year. So for now, let's focus on the community survey. I am going to give you a general timeline on how the Diversity and Inclusion Committee worked towards this survey. So as I mentioned, in May 2019, the committee was created. We started working towards a few deliverables first, and the first thing that we wanted to solve was to define the goals that we wanted for this committee. So that actually came in July 2019. Later on, once we had defined objectives, we knew that we wanted to partner with a vendor that had the skills and the expertise to help us get the data and make a scientific analysis very well. So we partnered with someone and we launched the first draft of the survey at the end of October of 2019. This draft was a collaborative effort in the committee. So the vendor who worked with us prepared questions, we shared it in the committee mailing list. And as we continue to work towards refining the questions, we came up with a general set of interview questions that was satisfying for the people collaborating in that. In December, we launched the survey. It stayed open for 4 weeks. And in March of 2020, we got the first preliminary results. And today, here at Flink Forward, you're gonna be the first people getting a glimpse at this data. I wanna make the caveat that the data that you're gonna see is not interpreted. There is not a deeper analysis in it. It's just the data that we got from the initial analysis. So I will put that caveat there because there's not really an insight to be drawn from there, and there is other type of analysis we want to do, and I'll walk you through that. All right. So let me tell you a little bit about the survey. As I mentioned, the survey was a collaborative effort where the vendor actually contributed or collaborated with the committee into putting together questions that were meaningful for us, questions we wanted to know about our community. So after doing this effort, we divided the survey into the following sections. We had a section about the contributor role and tenure because we wanted to understand how the Apache community interacts with the projects. Are they contributors? Are they committers? Are they part of PMCs? And how long have they been at the Apache Foundation? Then we had a section about motivation. We wanted to understand what is the context under which people contribute to projects. Is it pay? Is it volunteer? Is it a mix of them? And then we wanted to understand how is the availability of protocols and guidelines for people who are new to the foundation. Is it easy to understand and easy to find this information? Then we wanted to analyze the support that we have for newcomers. Have people, when they started contributing to the Apache Software Foundation, had mentors? Do they have it now? And lastly, we had a diversity and inclusion section that it was just based on demographics. And this is a section that I'm gonna share with you. Again, there's no analysis or insights driven from there. It's just the data that we had from doing some initial counting of the results. And lastly, we had a wrap-up section where we were asking participants if they wanted to continue to be engaged in their research, and if we could reach out to them to clarify a few points. So really quickly, again, how we divided the analysis was on 4 depths of investigation. First, we just wanted to draw demographic data. We just wanted to understand just counting the results of the pure checking of the first round of interviews. The second part was establishing relationships between different dimensions. So once we collected the information and we did an initial slice and dice, we wanted to start looking for causation and correlation on these dimensions. This part will help us define questions that are going to be further investigated through surveys. A third analysis that we want to do is create personas. How are the typical, who is the typical woman, the typical man, the typical person, non-English speaker, and understand what are their challenges and their experience in the Apache Software Foundation. And after we do these 3 analyses, we want to be able to draw insights and make recommendations to improve each of these situations. So now, without any further detail, I'm just going to go and share a few of these demographic insights that we got from the presentation, from the survey. So the first one is tenure. And in the first analysis, we find out that the majority of the community at the Apache Software Foundation has been involved in a project between 3 to 5 years. We also find out that the way in which people contribute to projects is mostly unpaid. So this is an important consideration to take when we are collaborating with people from all over the world. It's important to know, this is a voluntary work from them, and this needs to be taken into consideration for planning timelines or just collaborating with them. Something surprising though is that there is a lot of people who do this in a mix of paid and unpaid work, and also a lot of people who get paid to contribute to open source. And here you can see the breakdown. The second point is that at least 40% of the people who have contributed to the Apache Software Foundation have experienced some sort of friction or some sort of challenge. This is very interesting, and this is definitely one of the areas where we will be diving deeper in the further analysis. This is one of the statistics that we got is 87% of the community at the Apache Foundation identify themselves as men. Then in terms of age, we can see that the majority of people gravitate towards the age range of 35 to 44. And if we group together the largest categories of this age range, we can see that everybody is between 35 to 55 years old. That is the first three bars that you can see there. In terms of education, this was an interesting dimension that we added this year. We wanted to understand what is the level of education. And the majority of the people at the ASF has at least a master's degree. This is 45% of the community has at least this degree. Another dimension that we added this year is understanding the English fluency. And as we can see here, 7.05% of people do not feel confident in English. This could be one of the reasons why the ASF, some of the projects cannot engage with communities that are not English native speaker, why some people are not so active in mailing list, so many other reasons. And this type of causation and correlation is one of the areas that we want to explore deeper in further analysis. And lastly, I wanted to share with you a very interesting insight. This year, we also asked survey takers about in which culture they grew up and in which culture they currently live. This with the purpose of understanding if cultural differences can be a challenge when contributing to open source. And what we saw here is that it's pretty homogeneous, with the United States and Germany being the top culture from people who contribute, and also residency. And without anything else on my side, I'm going to pass it over to Markos, who is going to tell us about the diversity and inclusion efforts in the Flink community. Back to you, Markos.
Thanks, Chris. So since this is a virtual Flink Forward event, we really want to take a better look at some of the efforts of the Flink community and how the community really made some actions to include different geographies and become more involved with communities, developer communities in different countries, specifically for this case, for the case of China. So early on, the Flink community identified that there was a great adoption of Flink in China, and they really wanted to include the community to the global Flink community. So instead of separating the Chinese community, they wanted to include the community to the main Flink community globally. There was somewhat of a lack of support locally and advocacy. So by creating a Chinese user mailing list specifically designed for people to raise their questions, engage in discussions in Chinese language, and by empowering local contributors, committers, PMC members, and members of the community to engage there, there was a huge uplift in discussion and engagement there. And also there was a very large amount of traffic to both the documentation and the Flink websites. So we, as a community, the Flink team really wanted to enable the Chinese users to get the same level of understanding and be up to date with the latest developments on Apache Flink. The Flink website and parts of the Flink documentation were localized in Chinese, so that everyone has the same chance and the same resources available when building their applications or when they're thinking about adopting the framework. Finally, there's a lot of adoption from local companies, so Chinese companies, whether technology companies or other companies, adopting the framework. There was a twofold approach there to make sure that we represent Flink in a global scale. So first of all, we engaged the local companies and asked them to share their use cases in English. And we additionally localized the non-Chinese use cases in Chinese language so that the Chinese-speaking community also had the same access to the same examples and use cases of using and developing applications with Apache Flink, so that everyone has the same resources available on both ends, and the community is really globally represented. No matter which country you're visiting or you're engaging with, no matter which language you're engaging with. We saw significant uplift in the engagement and the adoption and adoption metrics such as visits to the documentation, downloads, Flink downloads, as well as a lot of more kind of like technical elements, like the amount of time that it takes for specific pull requests to be reviewed and merged or resolved. And this is really great and really showing how engaging communities from different backgrounds, in this case, different geographies and different languages, can really help develop the framework and move the framework forward. So if we move to the next slide, which I think it's the last one, we can really sum up. I don't know if you want to add anything here, Grace, from your side, but from what I've experienced with the Flink community, it's, I mean, being more diverse and having the actions and enabling the actions to have a more diverse community really helps the community grow, really helps the community develop at a significantly higher rate than before. I'm not sure what your thoughts are about this, but yeah, it would be good to hear your thoughts on this as well.
Yes, Marcus, thank you. I think, like as you mentioned, paying close attention to how inclusive and diverse your community is, it's really key to help it be more resilient in terms of having a strong community that can share the load equally in terms of maintaining a project. And it can also open doors to go to other communities and to go to other areas, even countries and languages that it hasn't been there yet. So I would say that those are all my only observations. And thank you so much.
Thanks.